Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to create our own web browser. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have created the skeleton of our Lite Web Browser. As current web browsers are quite complex beasts, we're starting off very straightforward and simple with our application. In the theory that to solve really large complex problems, you first break them down to much smaller and more simple problems, and then you solve these simpler problems one at a time. So today we're going to attempt to load up a very basic web page into our browser. So let's have a look at our code. We have only 4 functions within our current application. In the PB main function, this is where we're calling our first and only dialog. The dialog itself puts our controls on the screen. And currently we're clearing out the graphics control, which is going to be the body of our browser, and making the background black. We're going to change that right now to make the background white. And as we're going to be loading a file or files, we're going to add another library. This is our PB file handling routines library, which we've used in many videos. This contains some common functions for loading files. And our HTML document is indeed a file. So with that in mind, we'll need somewhere to actually obtain the file. The web browser will eventually be able to look at both static web pages located on a local drive to looking at websites. We're first going to look at straightforward flat text files which have an HTML extension. So we're going to create a folder called HTML pages, and this folder will contain our files. And this is our first page, page1.html. HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, is a process by which you can define the structure of a web page. I'm going to create the most simple web page you have ever seen. HTML tags are used to define areas of your web page. They will always start with the HTML tag, which will contain all the structure that's to appear on the web page. We also have a body section, which is used to contain all the structures and text that's appear in the body of the web page. Additionally, there is a tag called head, which is used to define the header of the web page. This can contain the title of the web page. So we're going to put a title in, and we're going to call this demo page. So here we have a very simple web page, which only contains the title of the web page, which is called demo page. So we're going to use this one as a starter. So let's now go into the code and set it up so that we can support this structure. First of all, I'm going to create a couple of global variables. These are going to be used to hold the content of the web page we're going to be displaying to the user. I'm going to use one global, HTML, to contain the data from the web page verbatim. The second one I'm going to be using for storing a lowercase version of this web page. This will allow us to read the tags more easily and disregard the casing of the text. So our first task is to allow the user to enter a URL in the text box. Once they've entered this URL, they would normally press the Enter button on the keyboard. So we need to be able to detect that an Enter button has indeed been pressed and check to see if they have entered a URL. So let's go into the code to see if we can manage that. In the event handler of our dialog is where we'll need to put this change in. Currently, we have no code in the WM command section, and this is where we'll need to add some in. You would normally expect to put a case statement in to detect the text URL box. However, what we're going to do here is to detect the pressing of the Enter key. Although there are no buttons on the screen to handle this, you could quite easily do a default setting on one of the image buttons at the top of the screen. However, I'm not going to do that today. We're going to actually use the IDOK constant. Although we don't actually have an object on this dialog that has this handle, it can be used to pick up the fact that the Enter key has been pressed. So what we have to work out is which control on the dialog last had focus. And we can do that quite easily by using a Windows API call. In fact, using two Windows API calls. The first one, getFocus, which will return the Windows handle, and the second call will turn that into a dialog handle, and we will then populate a variable called control. So we'll need to set control up as a variable at the beginning of this function. So we're going to set control up at the top as being the handle of our control, and we're going to set a string variable up to contain the URL entered by the user. And now that we have the control which last had focus, we can test the value we've got back to see if it matches the handle of the text box containing the URL. If that's been the case, then return has been pressed when the dialog had the focus to that control. So if we wish to test this out, we can put a message box in to pop out when the user presses the Enter key. So we run our application now, and if we hit the Enter key with the control currently focused on the text box, we get our message box. If we change the focus to another control and press Enter, nothing comes up. So we're quite happily detecting when the user presses the Enter key on this text box. This is very useful if you wish to detect Enter keys on a number of text boxes on a dialog. Next, we want to pick up the data that's held within that text box, and we're going to populate the URL variable. So having picked up the URL, the next thing we want to do is to render the HTML. So we're going to create a new function called render the HTML, passing it 3 parameters. The text of the URL, and 2 handles, the handle to the dialog and the handle to the tab control. So here is the skeleton of our new function taking the 3 parameters. Now I'm going to set up 2 variables here, one to hold the HTML file we're going to load in, and one to contain the tab number that has been selected. At the moment, we're only supporting 1 tab, so this would always contain the value 1 at the moment. Next, we need to make sure that the user has actually keyed in a URL. So trimming the value in that variable, if that returns an empty line string, then the user has keyed nothing relevant, and we can exit immediately. So if we get this far, then a URL has been entered. So what we will do first is use the graphics clear command to clear out the graphics control. Then we'll set the default font, which we set up earlier, and we'll set the position of the graphic control to the top left-hand corner. We're now going to print the word return pressed and the URL the user has entered, and then redraw the graphic screen. So let's run that code now to see if we can pick it up quite happily. Ideally, we want to put in the path to this file. However, as this is quite a long path, and to save us some time typing, we're going to create a substitution drive. This is a command that's been around in Windows for a very long time. It only takes 2 parameters, the drive letter we wish to use, and the path we want to use for that. Once this has been done, the Z drive will now show us directly to that folder, and will save us a great deal of typing. So we've keyed in a URL, and when we hit the Enter button, we get the words return pressed and the path that the user has keyed in that text box. So we can quite happily pick up the URL. Next, we want to load that file into memory. So we're going to create a new function called load HTML page. As I said earlier, there are 2 types of loading we're going to be doing here. Loading a local file, which is using a file path, and loading a full web page on a URL. So this load HTML page function can be used to work out which you are doing. And the output from that function is going to populate our global variable. And our second global variable, the lowercase version, can be populated on the line below. So here is the skeleton of our new function, taking its single parameter as the URL to the file we wish to load. At the moment, we're only going to be looking at local files. We can do the web files later. So we're going to make use of a function within our common file library to load the file into a string. That's the binary file as string function, taking as its parameter the URL the user has entered. And then we're going to remove any carriage return line feeds. If we look at this page in Notepad, we'll see it's a very straightforward page. However, each line has a carriage return line feed at the end of it. Carriage return line feeds are not displayed on your web browser. So we're going to remove all the carriage return line feeds so that we end up with one long string of text. The output from this function is the string containing all the text within our HTML page. So having successfully loaded the page, we next need to name the tab for the page we have just picked up. So if the return from that function is not blank, we can go ahead and get the tab which is currently selected. As we only have one tab, this will return the tab selected being a value of 1. We can then use the tab set text command to set the text on that tab. We're taking the URL and we're parsing it using either the forward or backslashes and going from the right hand side of the string backwards, taking the first element. If we try running our code now and putting our page in and hitting enter, it should now be labelled on the tab for the name of the file we have just loaded. So we have successfully picked up the name of the tab. So can we go further and pick up the title from inside the HTML? As we can see, we've created a title block containing the words demo page. It would be good if every single HTML document was correctly formatted. However, you cannot guarantee that this is the case. So before we render anything to our graphics control, we might want to do a validation on the HTML. So we'll create a small function whose job it is to return true or false. True if the HTML validates, and false if it does not. So if it returns true, we'll print the words HTML formatting OK, and if it's not, we'll print invalid HTML formatting. And we'll throw the value held within the HTML variable. And then finally, we will call the graphics redraw command to redraw the graphics control so the user can actually see it. So let's now create the validate HTML function. So this is our new function. This is using the inString command to test for the presence of the HTML tag, the closing HTML tag, and the body and closing body tags. If any one of these is not found, we will return the value false. Otherwise, we will return true. So if we run our application now, put our web page in, and it's returning the value HTML formatting OK. We are of course using the graphics control to display information to us, the developers. In a production setting, you would not expect these messages to be seen by a user. But now that we've validated the page, can we pick out the title block? So if the validation returns true, then we'll want to start rendering these HTML tags. So we'll create a new function to perform that. And we will call that function render HTML tags, giving it two parameters. First of all, the handle of the dialog, and secondly, the handle of the tab. So here is the skeleton of our new function. This is going to be the heart of our rendering engine. We're going to be stepping through the lowercase version of the HTML. As I said before, the HTML is now formatted in a lowercase string in one variable and as a mixed case string in the other. So we're going to be doing a for next loop, looking through this string one character at a time. And we're pulling the character value out and putting it into a character variable. And if the character is a less than sign, then that's the beginning of a command. It's the first character of a tag. So we'll need to pick up the value of the tag itself. What's between this less than sign and a greater than sign? So we're going to be needing some more variables. One to work out the starting position, one to work out the ending position, and a string to contain the command itself using the $$ command, which is basically looking to the lowercase value and the start and the end values. And we're going to populate a Boolean flag to say we're now inside a command and we're not exiting the command at the moment. These variables will be more obvious later on in the code. So now that we have picked up the command, we now have to actually pick up the end of the command. So we're going to put an else if here as well to pick up the end of a tag. So now that we know that the tag has ended, what do we do with the data? Well, we'll need to test the value of our command variable. Now, at the moment, we're not going to be doing anything with the HTML tag. We know it's there, but there's nothing we need to do at the moment. So we'll put a casing statement in just in case we need to do something later on. On the opening tag for body, we're going to set another Boolean variable. And we will set that to false when the body tag is complete. We will create all these variables at the beginning of our function shortly. And as well as the body tag, we're going to put an entry in for the head tag. Again, setting variables to say that it's true that we're inside a head tag and false to say we're outside. And we're going to be using this variable here, title, to contain the value within the title tag. So now that we have that in place, we want to pick up the title block itself. Just as we've done before, we're picking up the start and end positions, and we're populating the title, but this time we're populating it from the main HTML rather than the lowercase version. The in string is quite useful in that you can specify our beginning and ending tags in here quite nicely. And with the test to make sure that the in head Boolean is true, this ensures that we won't pick a title up from anywhere else other than inside the head block. And once the title block is actually closed, that's the point we want to populate our tab. And there we have the code, just as we did before, to select the current tab. In this case, it will always be tab 1. And we're going to set the text on that tab using the variables we've passed in and populating it with what we've populated into the title variable populated up here. So let's create all the variables we're going to be needing at the top of our code, and then we can try running the application. So if we run the application now, and we put in our web page, and hit the enter button, so we can see now that the title of the tab is now showing as demo page, which is what we had in the HTML code within the title, start and end blocks. So we've picked up the first piece of information from our HTML document. So now that we've successfully picked up a title, our next task is to pick up a paragraph. In the body section of the HTML, you'd expect a number of paragraphs appearing and other structures. So we'll handle a hello world paragraph in the body section. So let's have a look at the code to see how we can support this paragraph tag. So here is the structure for our paragraph starting tag. And we're doing a check to make sure we're in the body structure. So as we did before, we're working out the start and the end structures and pulling out and returning the data within them. As we're going to be doing quite a lot of this, these 3 lines of code could well be embedded into a single function. But we'll tackle that in a later video. Next, we want to print this data out to our graphic control. So we're going to create a new function called printData. But before we do that, we'll handle the closing paragraph tag. And again, we'll check to make sure we're inside the body tags. and we're just going to do a straightforward graphic print of a zero-length string. So let's create the header for our print data function. Now initially we're going to set this function just to print out a trimmed version of the data. If we try running that code now, and putting in our path, there is our hello world displayed in our graphics control. So let's put a second paragraph in to see what more we can do. And there is our new paragraph saying welcome back to everyone here. However, this paragraph has 2 line breaks forced into the middle of it. And our paragraph tag has to be able to handle line breaks. At the moment, our reload button is not functional. So let's go into the code and set up reload so we can actually see it in action. So here we are back in the event handler, picking up a click event on our reload button. The code in here is quite straightforward. We're picking up the URL the user has actually entered, and we're calling the function we've just created, render the HTML. If we run that code now, enter the URL and click the reload button, and it will reload quite happily. We can see this BR tag twice in the middle of our paragraph. So we need to have some code in place to detect the presence of a BR tag. So back into the render HTML tags. This is where we call the print data function. And what we'll need to do in this print data function is we'll need to determine if there are any BR tags. So if we populate a temporary variable with the lowercase version of the data we have been given, and we use the parse count command to count the number of BR tags we have found. If there are no tags at all, parse count will return 1. If there is 1 tag, parse count will return 2. So we'll need to test to see if the breaks variable is going to be greater than 1. And if that's the case, we'll need to do a for next loop to pull out the information between these tags. And we can populate a local variable called text using the parse command, trimming it and looking for the BR as a delimiter. And if the text variable is not a zero-length string, then we can print if the text is not blank by using straightforward graphics print command with our variable. And if there are no line breaks, we can just use graphics print on its own. So we will now create all the local variables we need at the beginning of our function, and we will try running the application once more. And there we have our welcome back to everyone here. So we effectively have 2 paragraphs, a hello world, a gap between the paragraphs, and a paragraph split into 3 separate lines. The next tag we're going to look at is the header tag. This is actually 6 tags, ranging from H1 to H6. Traditionally, the H1 tag gives you the largest font size on screen, and the H6 gives you the smallest. These can be used to set different headings at the beginning of your paragraphs. So we want to support 6 separate fonts. So we will create these at the beginning of our application. We're going to create a new function called create fonts. And the single font we're creating in here at the moment we'll take out and put into the new function. And at the end of our PB main function, we will then unload all the fonts. So we can take this code out, and we will create a new function to create the fonts. We're going to be creating a global array to handle each of the fonts. And we will paste in the text we had to create the default font, Courier New 12 point. And we will create a little for next loop to allow us to loop through and create fonts of different sizes, starting with 30 point and working down 4 points at a time. This will give us 6 fonts of decreasing sizes. And we will create an unload fonts function whose job it is to end each of these fonts. So we'll declare our global array at the top of the code, just underneath the existing font handle. So with that in place, we now have to handle the H1 to H6 tags. So back to the render HTML tags function. So we're going to put a case statement in that handles H1 to H6. We know this is the beginning of our header tag. So with the case statement in place, we can determine which heading number the user has actually entered by using $. This gives us a value which we can use to point towards the font we have set up, and use graphics set font to put that in place for all subsequent graphics operations. And subsequently we can pick up the ending of the header tag, in which case we're now setting the font back to the default font we've set up in the h-font variable. So now that we have the code in place, we now have to update our HTML document to put an h1 tag in. So we're going to make Hello World the largest heading text. So we save that and run our application. Now we can see the words Hello World in a large, bold font. So let's try updating our HTML and putting a second but smaller header tag in. So here we have an h2 tag with another paragraph with the words data next. So if we save that and just refresh our page, there we have data next as a smaller but still bold heading. So what we've achieved today is we have taken an HTML page and we have parsed it into our browser. We have handled paragraph tags, header tags, a title tag to pick up the name of the page, and we've done some simple validation to ensure that the HTML and body tags are in place. Obviously, there is a great deal more work to be done in creating a modern browser. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.